Hello friends, we are today concluding the short story series. They were started last year, and a large number of stories are written in European countries, particularly in England, France, Russia and America, have been discussed from the point of view of the role of the short story in contemporary life, as well as the knowledge that they afford to the reader in the limited time that they consume of the reader. So today's selection is about the stories of Hemingway, Ernest Hemingway, the American writer, and Dr. Richa Bajaj, who teaches English in Hindu College, Delhi University, will be presenting her point of view of the short stories in general and specifically of the ones that she mentions in her talk. And so far as I am concerned, and this being the last lecture, I would say briefly that the short story discussion has gone on pretty well, and short stories generally capture the glimpse of life, not the reality or the larger expanse of life around us, but they give us a kind of a window into the window to the experiences that human beings have in a limited period of time, and there they enlighten certain corners in our imagination and in our consciousness. So that has been discussed from different angles, from the angle of society of the countries to which the writers belonged, as well as to us who are Indian readers and who already have a view of the short story from our own angle. So all these points have converged upon the focus that the short stories received in this series. And so far as Hemingway is concerned, the 20th century writer, a giant, a Nobel Prize winner, and one who lived on his terms and also died on his terms, in the sense that he committed suicide at the ripe age of 62. And he was a writer of economy in language, and he must have taken a lot of inspiration from his predecessor, Leo Tolstoy, the 19th century writer of Russia. And Hemingway spent most of his time rewriting his stories, rewriting his novels. He's basically a novelist, but he also wrote a large number of short stories. So since our focus is on short story, therefore I would now request Dr. Richa Bajaj to make a few points regarding the short story in general written by him, as well as her view of the short story that she gains from the angle that she takes for discussion. So over to Dr. Richa Bajaj. Please begin your points.
Thank you, Professor Prakash. Yes, indeed, you're right in saying that Hemingway is a stalwart in many ways in American literature, particularly for the kind of work he did, and that he lived on his own terms and died on his own terms. So I think, I have covered during this series lectures, writers mostly of the 19th century or going over to the 20th century. So in a way, I have limited my discussions to 19th and early 20th century American literature. And I found during these discussions and that we had that American fiction had come a long way, because it had learned to experiment with its form. And in the short story particularly, I thought that writers tried to capture as much of the time in that moment of the short story, because again, the short stories were, as we all know, they were serialized. They were published in journals, and they would make the large chunk of whatever magazine work was done. So I think that giving the reader the chance to look into a particular phase or a particular aspect of life through the short story became the mainstay of this American short story that I've dealt with. So and there were issues again. Most of this American literature that we've discussed has brought to light that writers were very aware of the issues around them, and I think this is how perhaps England was during its Renaissance, because it had a will to define itself, and had a fair share of optimism within the country. So writers were also visionaries, and there was optimism. It had not reached a kind of a stalemate in that sense, because they were still looking to build an American literature, and it was raw, it was undefined. in the 19th century, and they tried to experiment in that sense to make something which is very American, and therefore you find that the American landscape constitutes a very big portion or has a lot to do with American fiction, because the area, the place itself, is a story. As Walt Whitman would say that America is the greatest poem ever written. So the point here is that that the landscape, the place, whether it's the sea, in the case of Melville, or in the case the southern region, the south, as in Kate Chopin, or even in Hemingway, you find that the locale plays a very important role in a lot of American fiction, because it draws its issues, also draws its stories from these locales. They're specific. For instance, Hemingway's, again, Old Man and the Sea is about the sea. And if it's the experience of a man who is a Cuban fisherman. So again, the idea that that occupation is brought to light because of the natural landscape of the region. So I think that and no one, I also feel that the northern, for instance, the intellectual hub of American literature, the region, the New England region, this is the area where theories are being formulated, where ideas are also coming to the fore, while very rugged sort of experiences are brought to the fore in the south. So I think within American literature also there's a lot of variety in that sense, because there is literature which is available on say the industries, the factories, the salesmen who constitute this kind of life, but then there is life on the field in next to coastal areas that also constitutes much of this kind of region. So I think it's experimentative in that sense. With language is uses a lot of dialect, and because it keeps the local flavor then of that particular region intact, and along with that it tries to pick up in the short fiction these issues. I mean, it touches upon these issues. I wouldn't say that there is enough space in the short story for to analyze them, but certainly these writers touch upon some very important issues of the late 19th century and 20th century. That's how I look at American short fiction of this period.
In a lighter vein, suppose I ask you a question, whether the American short story, according to you, is more geographical than historical. What would you say?
Yes, geographical certainly, I think, is certainly, I wouldn't say more or less, because you cannot separate the two really. How can you talk about a geography without referring to that historical phase? So I think they're inseparable, but yes, the geography plays a very important role, because they their sense of identity comes from the land. I think that is more, their sense of identity doesn't come from just being American. Being American by itself means being a part of a particular region and being a part of a place. So I think the land, the landscape, the topography itself, enables the writer to bring certain issues in place, and it tries to take into account, or it tries to project certain universal issues also. For instance, therefore it becomes very symbolical, that the idea of this idea of ambition, this idea of proving yourself as a human being, the strength in oneself, all these are universal ideas. So at one level they are universal ideas, but at another level they are limited or topical in that sense, because they belong to a particular place and time and the feeling of the time, I would say. That's how I would respond to this question.
Is there some struggle also in the American short story at the social level, at the individual level, struggle with self, struggle with society?
I think it is, the American short story is way too conscious of itself as a form, but also it depicts a self-conscious individual, and this individual is ripe in that sense in mind. This individual is a sort of a awakened, enlightened being who is struggling with the issues around oneself. So not so much in Hemingway's short story. In Hemingway's short story, in fact, he builds characters who are who are really who are a part of a system that they are unable to understand. But largely I feel that much of 19th century fiction has been about the struggle of the individual when pitched against social forces, and how they respond to them, and how do they respond to the crises of the time. So I think that is also one important element. Like whether you take Hawthorne, for instance, or Melville or Kate Chopin, you find that the individual is an aware individual and wants to pursue one's own will. In the face of circumstances that are too daunting, they are caught in a system, they are trapped in a system. Often they are tragic for that reason, because the individual cannot find a way out of this sort of quagmire that they are a part of. But in Hemingway, I find that Hemingway is also tragic in that sense. I don't know why, but a lot of 19th century and early 20th century American fiction is tragic. I've yet to come across something that goes in the direction of optimism. I think optimism has been left with Whitman and Whitman's age. Even though there is a sense of idealism, the writers often are helpless, often hopeless in the situation. For instance, Gertrude Stein mentioned that Hemingway belonged to that lost generation of the 1920s. That understood that no matter how much they cry for democracy, at home there is a class that has already taken over the system and is already built on the logic of profit making. So I think the idea that the human beings have lost this battle and the individual is constantly fighting social forces leads to a kind of a tragic end. Whether you look at Chopin or Hemingway or for that matter Hawthorne, you find that there is a sense, even in Melville, there is a tragic strain throughout American short fiction. What would you say?
No, I'm just thinking of the point that you are making, and it's a very important point about American fiction in general, that the individuals have their own kind of consciousness, and they want to play a role in life, but they end tragically, end up tragically.
Right.
Which means
also
there is
because
heroism.
They're too self-conscious, right?
Yes.
Of their own self, and they find it very difficult to not assert. They cannot just become a part of the milieu and become a part of the larger sensibility. They rebel against it, resist it, often end tragically in that sense. I mean, you look at, we've discussed how in Kate Chopin's characters often commit suicide in that sense. Hemingway himself committed suicide. So I think there is this strain there, that the inability of the writer to be able to make the difference, or the inability of the writer, or the awareness in the writer that one cannot after all make the difference that one thought one could. Like Hemingway, for instance, felt that all that he stood for, towards the end of his life, he felt that he was no more able to write, and that he had become insignificant, and he could no more play the part that he thought he could, and that playing that part could change things around, that things were too daunting and too big for the individual to handle, right?
Some criticism has been made about Hemingway, not in the negative sense, but in the appreciative sense, that is heroes who are heroic, of course, because they play a role, but then they are broken from within. They just don't know where to go, which direction to take, and therefore they are divided within themselves. Would you respond to this?
Yes, there is this sense, that that the hero is often a tragic figure again. That in fact, the idea of the heroic lies in the fact that the hero is probably going to die, and the defeat is right in your face, right? But then how you're going to take that defeat is what makes you heroic. So there is a sense that the heroic lies in the individual, even when one faces a sort of a fatal blow, one faces a kind of a problematic, or I would say that there is courage in the individual, and there is tenacity in the individual, because of which defeat can be faced on one's own terms. And to this, in fact, I'd like to quote, share a quote by David Galloway and John Whitley, who have put together a compilation of these 10 modern American short stories. And what they had to say about Hemingway was, and I quote, they said that the world Hemingway suggests is a soulless place constantly threatening to crush the individual. Only personal values of courage and tenacity will ensure that defeat can be faced on one's own term. A man must be defeated he must die. It is the manner of his defeat, of his conduct in adversity, which is all important. Since Hemingway's world is also a violent one, much emphasis is given to codes involving physical courage, unquote. So the idea that defeat is imminent and that adversity, your conduct in adversity is what constitutes the heroic. So the characters, for instance, the characters know that it's impossible perhaps to win, to come out clean from this situation. But how you conduct yourself in this moment is what constitutes the heroic in Hemingway. And that characters must die. There is a sense that they will die. It's all too evident that they would die. But their manner of defeat, is what he wants to. It's like, you die heroic in that sense, and try and become a martyr in that sense. So I think this is how I'd like to respond to your question, if it's answered.
And I think the argument that you are projecting sums up the entire, fictional span that you are covering, because there are many other writers also whose heroes struggle and they face also a kind of negative attitude at the end of their life, and that this seems to be the crux of the American short story. Would you agree with that?
I think yes, courage in that sense, a courage and a sense of resilience. But then they soon break, as you say, so the resilience also doesn't take them to sort of any positive endeavors. There is tenacity and courage, but often the characters, take death or tragedy accepted, but before accepting it, they are ready to, rise heroically. So I think in many ways this is what Brecht also said about heroism, that an insignificant individual actually has scope for heroism. Every individual has scope for heroism, and it is only when the individual is pushed in the extreme that this heroism surfaces. So I think it's a volatile world really that we are looking at. I mean, if you look at Hemingway's own life, you know that what he's going through series of wars. I think he's a man who loves adventure, and he constantly wanted to be out there in the world. But look at the kind of world that they are involved in. At the age of 17, soon after finishing his schooling, he joined this city newspaper which was called the Star in Kansas, and then he began his journalistic experience, career from there in order to hone. And in fact, a lot of his journalistic skills went on to make him a kind of a very precise, succinct, straightforward sort of writer, because he was constantly following a style guide, right, where it said short sentences and short paragraphs, and so he constantly used that kind of no nonsense sort of style in his writing as well. So he used this journalistic skill, and he was a journalist before he turned into a fiction writer. So he wrote terse, brief, sort of focused writing. But what I'm trying to say is that he joined soon after, once he became, he joined this journalistic career of his, he very soon decided to enter the First World War and volunteered to join the ambulance unit of the Italian army. I mean, the US army didn't take him in, they rejected him because of poor eyesight. So he enrolled himself in a International Red Cross unit, and joined the ambulance unit of the army as a driver. And he was wounded seriously in the war in 1918. And these are the experiences then that went on to making of the novel A Farewell to Arms in 1929. So what he does is to talk about the disillusionment of war. He's disillusioned with this kind of fierceness or masculinity that he thought as a young man he had, and that, he was invincible or immortal till he was seriously wounded in war, and then he realized that, what happens to everyone can happen to him. So these are the kind of references that you find in his novel A Farewell to Arms, which came out in 1929, and, driven by this kind of logic. So he's a part of the First World War. Then he's a part again of the Spanish Civil War. Then he joins again the Second World War. So constantly he's joining wars here and there. Spanish Civil War, he's joined as a foreign correspondent for another newspaper that he joined back once he was back in America. He joined the Toronto Star newspaper, became again a reporter for it. He was sent to Europe as a correspondent, and then he covered the Spanish Civil War. But again, he's very much into this world of wars, from the First World War, the Spanish Civil War, and then the Second World War. Again, the Spanish Civil War became the basis for his novel For Whom the Bell Tolls in 1940. So you can see how the man has constantly been going from one war to the other, and sharing his sort of complete disillusionment with this kind of endeavor where human beings are pawns, and and they become a part of a system that they did not choose to be a part of. So I think this is the volatile world that I'm referring to, that times during the first half of the 20th century is to do with all these wars, and a writer who's constantly has a first-hand experience of the war is able to capture that kind of essence where things are beyond human control. As a ambulance driver, what control does he have over the armies? He's constantly has the apprehension and is driven from one place to another. But what is the scope of individual effort or individual intervention in, say, countries fighting and are that so there is a kind of there is a kind of awareness that the individual has only limited role to play, and very soon the idea that he thought that he stood for, that is the idealist idea, is also broken. And here I'd like to quote Gertrude Stein, who said about Hemingway that Hemingway actually belonged to a lost generation. She says that, and she says that he belongs to the lost generation of idealists who went to the wars to fight, only to find that at home, that is back home in America, capitalism had entrenched American society, and capitalists in their own country were making fortunes in war profits. So out of war profits, the capitalists are making money, right? And it actually suits them, this kind of a struggle and this kind of war. So here there are writers who are going on the front, fighting battles for a kind of democratic life, for preserving democracy, and there you have a system back home, that is capitalism, that has entrenched American society to such an extent that they are actually making profits out of war. So hence the disillusionment of writers, and post-war America became absolutely indifferent to this kind of bloodshed, and and also sought this kind of hedonistic lifestyle of pleasure, and given the power of money that they had. So I think Gertrude Stein's assessment of this kind of a generation, the lost generation of America, of which Hemingway is a part, has a lot to tell us about the very historical epoch of which they were a part. And when discussing American short story, one has to keep in mind these aspects, at least the aspect that the writers are involved in wars, and what is the stance that they take in this period.
You have characterized in your discussion the American scene as the scene of Renaissance.
19th century.
Yes.
Yes.
So how do you explain that?
See, I think the 19th century American literature was more optimistic, and believed in a kind of progress and a kind of a boisterous sort of future for America, with Whitman probably as a pioneer of this kind of a work. Mm-hmm. And there is a sense of being able to create one's identity in this period. Mm-hmm. That following independence, our country goes through the phase of creating a kind of a nation building exercise. Mm-hmm. And in this nation building exercise of the early 19th century, writers often felt the need to create a literature that was not influenced by Europe entirely, and was not did not mimic European literature. They wanted to create a literature that could be distinctly called American. And what could be called American? Because you see, they were still looking towards Europe for inspiration. They were still looking towards Europe for European writers, the trends that were going on in England and other places, and bringing those trends in America. Very soon, there's a kind of a dissatisfaction that Melville and others felt about the writers around them, that they were not able to capture the essence of America because they were always looking outside. They were always looking towards Europe for some sort of inspiration, while inspiration had to be sought from home, from the cultures that existed within America, and the cultures were to be found from provinces and regions and the landscape of America. So once the writer tried to build a sort of an American identity, then that American identity included people's behavior, language, their modes of celebration, the geographical place that changed their lifestyle. and the way they conducted their lives, but also their occupation, their source of income. So all of this together, I think, made an American identity for these writers, who then tried to build an ethos, or a kind of what you could call as a fashioning of the self along these lines. And which is why I said this is close to a kind of a Renaissance model, where you're elated about the fact that you are a new country and now you are going to build a democratic nation. So, and it is progress, and you are able to, you have money, you have been able to preserve money, you've been able to build industries, you're also been able to build, say, the railways. That's a very big boost. Inventions in science and technology, all of them I have assisted the human being and made the human being self-aware, but also very positive about one's contribution in life. So I think that's the early phase of the 19th century that I refer to as Renaissance. But very soon, and this resurfaces with the American Civil War in the 19th century, because a lot of people who fought for the rights of the black, or for abolition of slavery, were driven by the idea of democracy. Otherwise, why would they want to make their lives difficult by getting rid of the black slaves? Because they believed in a kind of equality. And so the Civil War was a kind of Lincoln's contribution was a kind of realization of the democratic ideal. But once you move closer to the close of the 19th century, towards the end of the 19th century, you find that very soon industries, manufacturing units have taken over, and a new class has come into being, of that of the capitalist class, which is turning monopoly, and which is now building corporations, which means small capitalists are coming together as corporations. Anti-labor laws are being made at the time. There are lots of these protests that are going on, and during this period, America is moving consistently towards a very dehumanized way of life, and also a very fast-paced capitalist model, which seems to give way to the American dream of the early 20th century, followed by 1929 crash, the American depression. So I think that this is the tragedy of America also, that it set out as a very democratic country. It set out with the vision of democracy, but that vision was never implemented, because constantly the laws and the rules defining it were turning anti-human beings and anti-labor, and turning more towards profit-making ventures. And I think towards the end of the 19th century and early 20th century, you see this kind of an American breakdown, that the writers are able to prophetically see even before the Great Depression takes shape. So Hemingway has been a part of this world. In fact, a lot of writers have suggested that Hemingway was able to preserve his sense of idealism precisely because he left America. And he left America and settled in Europe for a time, and that distance gave him a sense of energy. Because being in America, it was impossible to be able to talk about any kind of idealism, because you were constantly surrounded by the tragic life that human beings, the tragedy that they were a part of.
So friends, in a very closely argued statement, Dr. Bajaj has given us the background against which Hemingway's short stories can be judged, can be evaluated, can be assessed. And in the following discussion, we will be focusing upon, Dr. Bajaj will give us a view of a few selected short stories where all this is found in the crystallized form. Thank you.